I'm going to kind of continue with a theme that we've had for the past several weeks, which is really no theme. In fact, if you're new to Summit, if you haven't, maybe you've just come in like the last 4 or 5 weeks. My name's Brad. I'm one of the pastors here, and if you're new, you probably haven't seen me. Even though I teach a lot of the time here, I've just been taking some time the last few weeks to work on some of the discipleship stuff that Seth talked about earlier that we're launching this fall, and so we've been shooting some videos and writing some content. So I've been focused on that, and I've been sitting where you've been sitting. In fact, even on Sunday nights, I've been sitting in the back. Last week, I met a couple people, and they didn't know who I was, and that was fun. And I was like, "Hey, yeah, my name's Brad," and that was great. So. I've been able to just sit back and be impacted by the messages that our teaching team has been bringing. And really, we just said, hey, whatever you feel like God's leading you to, like whatever you feel like God's put on your heart to share with us as pastors in our community of faith, just bring it. And I got to tell you, like every week I show up and I'm like, man, this is really, really good stuff. And every week it's been stuff that I needed to hear. And so it's been good to kind of be in that reverse role. But tonight I want to begin, and we're going to kind of continue in this theme of not having a theme. And I just want to share one message, one story about Jesus. And before I get to that, I want to just revisit something that Seth talked about last week. And so I know last week we didn't do a Sunday night service, so maybe some of you weren't here. But Seth last week talked about some ideas. Seth, right there, that guy, he also takes the offering, is a bull rider in his spare time and can ride a unicycle. But Seth last week was teaching, and he said some things that really hit home. In fact, all week long I've just been thinking about some of these things, and it really sets us up for the text that we're going to be in tonight really well. And so I want to reiterate some of the things that he talked about. What he was talking about last week was how we get transformed. Like, first of all, he sort of addressed this thing, like, do we really change? Can we really change? Can our character change? Can our habits change? Can we be transformed as people? And then he began to share with us the way in which we are changed. Like what shapes us? What actually influences who we become? And what adapts our character? What forms us as people? And there were 3 things that he mentioned that I just want to reiterate tonight. First one was this. He said it was the stories that we believe. Secondly, it was the habits that we develop. And third, it's the relationships that we cultivate. I don't know if that's specifically how he said it. That's how I wrote it in my notes. But it was the stories that we believe, the habits we develop, and the relationships we cultivate. In other words, the stories we believe, our culture, the scriptures, our families, they all tell stories. There's a narrative that's being told, and the stories that we believe to be true will influence us and the decisions that we make, and they will determine the direction of our life. We will make choices based on the stories, the narrative of our culture that we think is truest. That will define us. And then the habits we develop, the things we regularly participate in, those things eventually begin to shape us over time. Those things start to shape our character and who we are. And then finally, the relationships that we cultivate, the people that we hang out with, will influence us. Now, toward this end, I want to walk through a story tonight that if we believe this story is true, if this is one of the stories that we say there's some authenticity to this, there's truth to this, then I believe this story should impact us in fairly powerful ways. Like, if we choose to allow this to be one of the narratives that we believe is true, it has a significant impact on us. In fact, in a couple of different categories. Let me say this. If you came tonight and you are in a particularly complicated season in life, like you've got a variety of decisions to make, or maybe you find yourself dealing with anxiety, or you have choices, you don't know exactly which direction to go, you find yourself maybe just in a complicated time, I think what we're going to look at tonight is really relevant for where you're living. I'll also say this, if you're in a position where you have more questions than answers, I think this is a passage that's going to actually speak to some things in your own life. I would even say this, that if tonight you're here and you're just exploring faith, and that's something we love around Summit, is we just want this to be an environment where you can ask questions. And maybe you're asking questions about Jesus and who he is, and you're kind of wondering some things about what it means to be a Jesus follower. I think that tonight's going to surprisingly show you some things that will contradict maybe some assumptions that you've made about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So the story's going to be about Jesus, and it's going to challenge us as we look into it. Before we dive into it, I just want to share something I came across this week as I was preparing for this. It was written about 100 years ago by this Canadian pastor, which I was like initially just kind of stunned. Like, good stuff comes from Canada, and just totally kidding. I've been taking shots at Canadians all day today, and they've been taking shots at me. But But there's this Canadian preacher about 100 years ago. His name's James Francis, and he wrote several books. What I'm going to share with you is an excerpt from a sermon that he preached, and I think it's a really good way for us to set up where we're going with the text tonight. So just listen to what he said. Speaking of Jesus, he said, "Here is a man who was born in an obscure village as the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another obscure village. He worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30, and then for 3 years was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book, never held an office, never owned a home, never had a family, never went to college. He never put his foot inside of a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place he was born. He never did one of the things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He had nothing to do with this world except the naked power of his divine manhood. While still a young man, the tide of popular opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. Another betrayed him. He was turned over to his enemies. He went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed upon the cross between two thieves. His executioners gambled for the only piece of property he had on earth while he was dying, and that was his cloak. When he was dead, he was taken down and laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 wide centuries have come and gone, and today he's the center of the human race and the leader of the column of progress. I am far within the mark when I say that all the armies that ever marched, and all the navies that were ever built, and all the parliaments that were ever sat, and all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man upon the earth as powerfully as this one solitary life." It's really good, right? And yet there's something interesting. When you hear this, you hear something that I probably hear, and that's that Jesus was incredibly unconventional. He was remarkably unconventional in the way that he did things. In fact, there's nothing in his story, there's nothing about all that I just read that would give you an indicator of the impact he would have on the world. Like, there's nothing in it. There are no predictors. There's nothing conventional about Jesus. There's nothing status quo about Jesus. It's not like Jesus was doing these things and then there were these leadership books or influence books that were being written during his day, and like Jesus was doing this stuff and people were like, "Oh yeah, no, he's been reading these books on leadership, and so that's why he's throwing himself on a cross for people." Like, no, like there's none of that. Like, nobody ever said the way to change the world is to do the things or even not do the things that you're doing here. So why is this important? Why do we need to recognize this? It's important to recognize because stories like the one that we're going to be looking at tonight, they not only reveal the unconventional nature of Jesus, but I think it also challenges us to be unconventional in our discipleship to him. Like, if Jesus is that unconventional, if he's that different, that probably means his disciples are fairly unconventional in the way that they pursue him. Like, if this is true, then we're probably being asked to do far more than just think of Jesus in very conventional terms and follow him in very conventional sorts of ways. And by the way, if you're struggling, if you find yourself saying, I get that there are these promises of Jesus, and I understand that there are experiences that people should be having that follow Jesus, but they're not consistent with you. You say, that's not a reality for me. I'm not actually experiencing those things. Maybe the reason is that you're following a conventional Jesus of your own imagination in very conventional ways that work for you, rather than experiencing him in his unconventional nature. So this story we look at tonight, it's in Matthew chapter 14. And if you have a Bible, it can be on a device, or if you actually have one of those paper things that's called a Bible, you can open that up to Matthew chapter 14. Verse 22, if you want to take some notes tonight, there's going to be a few observations that we're going to make. Before I start walking through these verses, I want to just give you the context for what's happening, what happens before the story that we're looking at tonight. And the story before the story is actually one that we know, and a lot of us are familiar with it, because it's the story where Jesus is gathered on the shores of a lake, or shores of a small sea, and he's been teaching some people, and they're really hungry, and long enough hungry that they're probably a little hangry. It's getting towards the end of the day, and there's no food to feed these people. And then Jesus finds this little boy, the disciples find this little boy, and they bring him to Jesus, and he has some loaves and some fishes. How many of you have heard this story? Right? So kind of an amazing story where Jesus does something completely outside the box. He blows everybody's categories. And with he and his disciples, they just start distributing the food. And somehow when they're done, everybody among 5,000 people eats. Like they all eat and they're all happy because people get happy when they eat. That's just like a normal thing, right? All people everywhere get happier when they eat. And so they feed everybody and they're just like blown away. So people then, because they've never seen anything like this and now they're experiencing the benefit of Jesus' unconventional nature, they begin to press in around he and his disciples. It's like they want more, not just food, but they want more of his teaching. They want more of his influence. They want more of this Jesus who's being shown to them. So when we pick up the story, it's immediately after these people have been fed. The loaves have been gathered up. There were actually leftovers, which is unbelievable. And then now we read this in verse 22 of Matthew 14. It says this. It says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, which, by the way, there is a very introverted part of who I am, and I love this part of who Jesus is, right? And those of you that are introverts, you probably go, yeah, that sounds really nice. Like, even tonight, I don't mind being at church for a little while, but I want to go be alone, right? That's what Jesus does, right? He's like, I got to get out of here. And so he puts the disciples and sends them away in the boat, and then he goes, I've got to go spend some time away. I got to just like spend some time in prayer by myself. And we come to verse 24. It says, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them, and in the fourth watch of the night, let me just explain, in the fourth watch of the night, this is somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m., so this is in like the middle of the night, early morning hours, right? They're battling the waves. They're exhausted. So some of us have had nights like this, right, where you've had to work on something through the night, or you've had to weather some sort of storm. Maybe you were camping. Maybe you had some sort of experience. Those of you that have had kids, maybe you've had a kid that was sick and you're just exhausted and the kid's not doing well in the middle of the night. You're just battling and there's that exhaustion. You're like, is this going to ever end? Will these kids ever grow up and leave my house? And the answer is yes, they eventually do. But you just, there's these nights that just seem like they will never end and you're exhausted and you're battling. That's what's happening here. It's the fourth watch of the night and they're exhausted. And then it says in the next verse, it says, and he, speaking of Jesus, came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, it's a ghost. And they cried out in fear. And immediately Jesus spoke to them saying, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. And Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and he walked on the water and he came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. So Jesus immediately reached out his hand. He took hold of him, saying to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Now, there are some observations that I think might challenge some of our thinking around Jesus that I want to make tonight as we start to unpack what's happening here. And the first thing I really want you to catch is this, that Jesus sends his disciples into the storm. Did you catch this? Jesus sent his disciples into the storm. Like, the disciples didn't choose to go for a boat ride. They were like, hey, you guys want to go for a row? And like, let's jump in the boat. And like, Jesus, you need some alone time. We're going to go like row the boat for a while and you can catch up with us later. No, it says immediately after the whole miracle of feeding people, Jesus put them in the boat and said, go, like you row off into the storm. Jesus sends them out. We're talking about Jesus doing this. And I think about this whole scenario, I go, well, Jesus could have done any number of other things in this. Like, first of all, he could have just had them hold out and wait, right? Hey, guys, I need some alone time. I'm going to go spend some time praying up in the hills. I'll be back in a little while. And trust me, I'm stronger than all of you because I'm Jesus and I'll help you row, right? He could have done that. He could have just prayed for traveling mercies and a hedge of protection. That's what Christians do, right? You're going on a trip, you're going to go row across the sea somewhere. You pray for traveling mercies and the seas get flat and everything gets good. Jesus could have done that, right? Because Jesus is Jesus, he could have parted the sea like Moses and they could have just walked on dry land, right? Could have done all of those things, but that's not what Jesus does. He puts them in a boat and he says, start rowing. And I want you to catch this. Jesus is perfectly comfortable with them being uncomfortable because of the storm. You see this? Like, he sends them out and he's comfortable with this. So it makes me want to ask this question. Does the Jesus that you follow do this sort of thing? Does the Jesus that you follow, your idea of who Jesus is, do you expect Jesus to push you off and be perfectly comfortable with you being in a storm and uncomfortable? Or is your conception of who Jesus is, the way you think of the Jesus you're following, the kind of Jesus who says, no, like I only send you out on smooth days. Like, in fact, for some of us, we would actually say the reason I follow Jesus is so I can avoid storms, right? Like the whole point of me following you, Jesus, is because I don't want to be in these circumstances. And so it sort of confronts some of our thinking around who Jesus is. And could it be that in our effort to avoid the chaos, in our effort to avoid the storms and to only have flat, calm seas, that we're actually missing out on the unconventional ways of Jesus? He sends them directly into the storm, and then he goes to pray. That really makes me wonder about my own storms, my own situation. I mean, what if the situation I'm in, which by the way, just because I stand up here doesn't mean I don't have storms. Doesn't mean that there are scenarios where I feel very uncomfortable because of the circumstances of my life. And I know the same is for you. But think about the situation that you're in or that I'm in. Is God perfectly comfortable with the uncomfortable situation that I'm in? Like, what if God has me right here, right now, because he wants to show me something? Like, what if he isn't rescuing me from my situation, not because he doesn't love me, but because he wants me to see something about who he is, and the only way that's going to happen is in the middle of a storm? What if God's restraining himself and he's not delivering me from whatever storm I'm in, because ultimately what he cares about is doing something in me rather than simply doing something for me? I know this challenges all sorts of our thinking around who God might be. Like, well, if God is love, how is that loving, right? How is Jesus loving if this is what he's doing? Well, let me give you a couple reasons why this is loving. First of all, this is loving because Jesus has the power to calm the storm. If Jesus didn't have the power to calm the storm, this wouldn't be very loving, right? Hey guys, I want you to row out into the storm. You're going to learn some lessons. And by the way, you are completely outside of my control. Have fun with that, right? That's not very loving, but Jesus has control over the storm. So he sends them out into circumstances he has complete control over, and he proves that later. So Jesus is loving and that he's still in control of the scenario. Secondly, Jesus knows what's best for us and he does what's best for us. That's the definition of love. He knows what's best for us, and he still does what's best for us, even when that creates tension in our own hearts and our own thinking. Like Tim Keller, writing on that same concept, he says this. He says, if you have a God great enough and powerful enough to be mad at because he doesn't stop your suffering, you also have a God who's great enough and powerful enough to have reasons that you can't understand. And you can't have it both ways. There's an interesting note in this that in the Gospel of Mark, we actually read the same story in the Gospel of Mark. There's 4 biographies of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each one of those biographies are written from a little different perspective, and they really target a different audience. Mark is actually written from the perspective of Peter. Mark sort of transcribed Peter's story of who Jesus is. And so Mark includes some details that aren't included in the same story in Matthew chapter 14. And there's one particular thing that's really kind of crazy. When Mark tells this story, he says that when they were out in the storm and they're struggling, it says that Jesus was passing by them. Like it was an accident. Like they ran into each other out. Like those guys are rowing against the waves, and Jesus was like, and he's like, oh. And they all like, Jesus, like, what, help. Like it's like this moment. So he describes them passing by, and it's like, okay, what in the world's going on? Is this sort of random that they bumped into each other in the storm on the sea? Or could there be more to this? It's really fascinating. That language of Jesus passing by, that parallels some language that we see in Exodus chapter 33 and Exodus chapter 34. It also, in Matthew chapter 14, the one we're in here, it also has language in it that in a similar way parallels something that we read about in Exodus 33 and 34. And these are the similarities. It's really kind of a beautiful thing. In Exodus 33, Moses approaches God and he says, God, I want to see your glory. Like, I want to see you. I want to know you. I want you to reveal yourself to me in a powerful way. And so God says to Moses, I'm going to do this, but here's what you're going to do. I'm going to hide you in the cleft of a rock. I'm going to kind of shove your face down in the dirt. And then I'm going to pass by you. Like my glory is going to pass by you. It's going to pass you by. The same language that Mark uses to describe Jesus when he passes by the boat. He says, I'm going to pass by you. And then when you read about this happening, the Lord reveals himself to Moses and he says, this is who I am. I am the Lord. Now, I know you probably didn't bring a Greek New Testament with you this evening, but when we come to Matthew chapter 14 and Jesus is walking by the disciples and they cry out, he says, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. But if you actually look at the Greek language, and instead of saying it is I, he says ego eimi. That's the Greek word, ego eimi. He says, take heart, ego eimi. Ego eimi is translated literally, I am. It's one of the names of God. It's one of the names that God uses to say, like, before everything was, I am. Jesus, in this moment, he's passing by the disciples. He's revealing his glory to them. And then when they call out to him, he says, I am, I am. I am the creator of the storm that you sit in. I am the creator of this universe in which you find yourself. Jesus is saying, this is who I am. You are seeing me in all of my glory. And it is in circumstances that you never would have imagined. See, for them, they probably thought it'd be a really great worship service at Summit Church on a Sunday night. Like, that's when we're going to see the glory of God. But in the middle of a storm, in the middle of these sorts of circumstances, I don't know the specific storm that you're facing. Some of our storms are really obvious. They're really simple to ask people to pray for. Sometimes we lose jobs. And we have relationships that just blow apart, and we have financial problems, and sometimes we have just situations that take place. And some of those things are really easy just to put on a piece of paper, or to tell a group of people and say, man, would you pray for me? I'm walking through this storm. Others of us, maybe it's not that forward to identify. Maybe it's not that clear and it's more nuanced. And for some of us, maybe it's just emotional things. Maybe there's anxiety that we deal with, or maybe there's depression or sadness that we're wrestling with. Maybe they're just these questions like, do I really believe these things, and do I lean into them, or do I just sort of like muddle my way through life? And so we wrestle with our experience. It doesn't matter if it's obvious or if it's nuanced. The point is, all of us are in storms. Like, all of us. Everybody in this room, like, nobody gets to live a storm-free existence. Like, that does not exist in the world today. And what if the place that we are in, whatever storm we find ourselves in, is the place where we will see Jesus in all of his glory? Not when he calms the storm, but before he calms the storm. What if, despite our thinking that if Jesus is Jesus, we'd have smooth sailing, he unconventionally meets us in the middle of that weird tension, those moments when we feel anxious and we feel sad and we don't know what to do and we are frustrated? What if in those moments when our anger is boiling up inside of us or our nervousness is seeping out of our pores, what if it's right in the middle of that moment that we actually see Jesus for who he is? I love this moment where Peter calls out to Jesus to save him. He's thinking, hey, Jesus, save me. I love this because, do you notice that Jesus, he doesn't tractor beam Peter out of the water. He doesn't use the force. It's not like, okay, he kind of raises him up and levitates and pulls him towards him. You notice in the story that Jesus reaches down. He reaches down and he takes his hand. Like there's this relational intimacy that Jesus exhibits towards Peter. He could rescue him any way. The God of the universe who created everything, including the storm and the seas that they're in, he could have chosen any way to save Peter. And yet he reaches down and he touches him in the middle of this. I think that just tells us something about who God is. That we have this God that has all this power and this might. And instead of just snapping his finger in our circumstances and making everything smooth and fixing it all, he says, no, I'm going to step into humanity and I'm going to live a life that you would never have the opportunity to live, and I'm going to die the death you probably should be dying. But the reason that I'm going to do that is so that when you cry out to me in the middle of your storm, you actually have a hand that will take hold of you and pull you up. See, I want you to understand something about who Jesus is and about our faith. And this is really important for you to get. We are not rescued by the strength of our faith, but by the one in whom we put our faith. The Christian life, it is less about us having this audacious faith as it is about putting your faith in something that's powerful enough that you can have that kind of faith. Like, it's not like we have this like faith orb inside of us, so we just get it really going. Like, oh, I'm feeling really good about my faith. And when you feel strong in your faith, that somehow is what's going to rescue you. Like Jonathan Edwards on this same subject, he says, there are many religions whose belief is every bit as powerful as ours. They're just as convinced and just as devoted as we are. What makes faith worthwhile is not its strength. It's not how convinced you are or how much you believe, but it's the object of your faith. It's what you believe in. It's the object of your faith. So let me just give you this example. If I'm walking alongside of a cliff and I stumble and I fall off of that cliff and I reach and grasp for something. We've all seen this in cartoons and movies, right? There's always on the edge of a cliff, there's always a root or some branch that's hanging there, right? If I'm falling off of a cliff and I turn and I reach for the branch or the root that's hanging out, do I stop and do I evaluate the ability of the branch to hold me in that moment? Like, do I analyze and go, well, it looks really well grounded, or no, that looks kind of flimsy and I'm not sure that it's going to really, do I worry about my trust in the branch, or do I just grasp onto it? I grasp onto it. And the only thing that matters is not how much I believe in its ability to save me. It's its capacity to actually save me, right? That's the nature of our faith. It isn't the strength of our faith that saves us. It's the strength of our Savior that saves us, that makes that faith worthwhile. So what do you trust in? What do you reach for? Can I just say this? Like, we reach for so many things in the middle of storms. Like, when we're wrestling with all this stuff, can I just say this? Like, if you're married, will you just take the pressure off your spouse to be your Savior? And if you got a job somewhere, will you take the pressure off your boss? And will you take the pressure off your kids if you've got kids? Like, they don't need to be perfect. They don't need to be superstar athletes. And will you take the pressure off your friends to fulfill all your needs? Will you take the pressure off your parents to be perfect parents? Will you take the pressure off your academic or athletic performance? Will you take the pressure off of your money? Okay, here's the thing with all that stuff. All that stuff is perfectly fine. It's all pretty neutral. But all of that stuff, it makes horrible gods. Like, if you turn those things into gods and you grasp those in storms, you will be let down. We simply need to come to a place where we say and do what the disciples did at the end of this. In verse 33, it says that those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." They fixated on Jesus. Do you see this? It wasn't like, hey, Jesus, thanks for calming the storm. That's not what they were talking about. It was just they were blown away by Jesus. It wasn't like, hey, thanks for getting us into that new house that we wanted. Thanks for getting us into that new car that we wanted. Thanks for getting into the school that I wanted to go to. Thanks for providing that girlfriend or that boyfriend that I want. Like, that's not what this is. It is just Jesus-centered. It's all about Jesus for them. They didn't notice the storm because they were focused on Jesus. You know, there's all sorts of fascinating imagery that's woven through this passage. And one of the ones that I just want to give you before we close tonight is this idea that in the Old Testament, whenever the oceans are referenced, the imagery of the ocean is always imagery that's used to capture the sense of uncertainty that human beings live with about life. Oceans have always been characterized by uncertainty. Like, oceans represent a power. They represent an unknown nature to things. We've always talked in mythology about things that live in the ocean, whether it's the Loch Ness Monster or the Leviathan or, whatever it might be, massive giant sharks, the Megatron or whatever it's called, or Megalon, Megadon, I don't know what it's called. It's like Jaws 2.0, that's all it is, right? But we always kind of fascinate ourselves with what's going on in the ocean, and just sort of represents the unknown, uncertain nature of life. And so when you read in the Psalms and you read in the Proverbs, and there are these references to the oceans and to the depths, those references are talking about our uncertainty, that there is a certain amount of uncertainty that human beings just live with. So now fast forward to this moment, and the significant statement that Jesus is making, that when he shows his glory to his disciples, it is standing on the seas, which represent the depths of uncertainty that people live with in their lives. It is in the middle of the storm, on the sea. And he says, in this moment, I want you to get that I am greater than your greatest fears. And as long as I'm with you, you've got nothing to fear. See, this story is confronting the myth of our culture that says the boat's the safest place to be. That's the myth of our culture. Safe. You want to be safe. Be conservative. Be conventional. And that's the myth that we buy into. We decide this is what safety looks like, and then we ask Jesus to deliver us to safety. Let me just challenge you. Don't buy the lie that the safest place that you can be is in the boat. Jesus reveals here that the safest place that you can be is by his side in a very unconventional way, in very unconventional circumstances. See, Jesus, he doesn't just conquer the storm, he conquers sin and death. And Jesus doesn't just rise us up over the waves, he rises us up over the power of death, and he gives us the power of the resurrection. And the best place we can be is living in this space with Jesus. I love this epic moment where Peter sees Jesus, and in the chaos of the storm, like if you want to translate it to our times, Peter didn't have the margin in his life. Peter had set up boundaries in his life that should have kept him from getting out of the boat. But Peter just blows past all the margin. He blows past all of the chaos. He blows past the storm. He blows past the idea that he should wait till a better time to try to walk on water for the first time. And he just says, Jesus, if it's you, call me out. And then we read, Peter got out of the boat and walked on water. Peter walked on water. We know Jesus did, but we somehow seem to forget that Peter walked on water. This past week, Sherry and I were down in Phoenix. We were dropping off Maddie, our middle daughter, at Grand Canyon University. It's been kind of a busy couple of weeks. Our oldest daughter got married 2 weeks ago and moved to Hawaii with her new husband. And then this week we were down, and our other daughter is, going to school, and so lots of emotions, like lots of dad emotions. For some reason, I'm strangely angry with lots of young men in my life right now, and I don't know why. It's like totally irrational. Like I just don't trust guys under 25. And so it's just like a thing. So we were down, and we're at Grand Canyon University where she's going to school. And I was just being like the typical dad, and like my oldest daughter, I didn't get to go on that trip to drop her off at school, but I did get to go on this one. And so I'm just like monitoring everything. Like, how's the security? Like, I went to that school. I know the neighborhood it's in. And I'm like, man, the security better be really good or I'm not leaving. I'm going to school with her. And I'll just fly home for the weekends and preach, and I'll just study down there. And so like I'm monitoring all this stuff and kind of watching. I'm kind of getting a lay of the land. I'm kind of liking it. And then I'm just kind of geeking out on being the dad who's there. Like, I would have bought the shirt if Sherry would have let me, but she said, we're not doing that. You're not going to be those parents. And so there was this orientation where they have a big basketball arena, and they were getting all the freshmen into this arena, and it was supposed to be a parent thing, and her and her roommates all take off, and all the parents were putting together dorm furniture and stuff. And then we all simultaneously get text messages from our girls that say, you guys don't need to come. It's okay. We got this. And I was like, I'm going to the orientation or thing. Like, you don't need to know I'm there, but I'm going. And so Sherry and I, we go, and then there were like the rafters. We went up high, like the last row. So like maybe she won't see us and know that we're here. And I'm listening to this whole thing, and they're talking about the rules. And I was excited. I was like, I like these rules. I'm looking at all the guys, like, you hear the rules that they're talking about? I will kill you if you don't obey the rules. So I'm listening to all this stuff. They're talking about the police force and how many policemen per student. And I'm like, I like this. This is good. I'm going. And so we're listening. And the more I'm sitting there, the more I'm kind of loving this whole environment. It's really, really exciting, really good. And then towards the end, there was this guy that gets up. And I think he's like the student body president. He's a senior. He's going to talk to all these freshmen. And he starts talking, and he says something I never expected him to say. He gets up and he goes, so I want you guys to know, when I first started coming here, Grand Canyon was my second choice. I didn't get into the school I wanted to go to, and so I really wasn't very happy to be here. And he goes, all these people are running around, they're all enthusiastic and wearing purple and jumping around and acting excited. And he goes, honestly, their enthusiasm made me hate them. And he said, so I just was like grumpy, and I kind of pulled away from the whole thing, and I just kind of sat in my dorm and avoided all the school spirit, college junk. And he said, and then we started the second semester, and he said, I realized I wasn't having any fun, and everybody else really was. And he said, and so one night I was just sitting in my dorm, and I realized I don't really have anything to lose if I go, and he said this phrase, he said, if I go all in. He said, if I go all in, I really don't have anything to lose. And so then he goes on with this whole talk about going all in, and being a part of it and just like what it looks like to just push everything to the middle of the table and to not have any regrets and to say, man, I'm going to soak in all of this experience. And as he was talking about this, I just began thinking about this idea of following Jesus, this idea of Peter getting out of the boat, this idea of what it looks like for you and I to follow him in unconventional ways. And I just realized that for many of us, what we need is for somebody to stand up and say, would you go all in? Would you get out of the boat? Like, go all in. So Sherry and I, we were spending the next couple of days driving around, and we were talking about being all in and what it looks like to be all in. And let me just say this, just one thing that you can catch tonight. Unconventional followers of an unconventional Jesus go all in regardless of the circumstances. They don't sit around and go, man, I just need more time. I need more money. I just need to get some things done. No, they get out of the boat when the storm is brewing. And they go, no, you know what? I'm going to follow Jesus no matter what, no matter where. That's what I'm going to do. As Sherry and I were talking about this, we I don't know, I just started kind of ranting a little bit, and then I decided I'd rant tonight a little bit about this, going all in. And I just want to say a few things about what it looks like to go all in. And let me just say to parents that have kids, would you please go all in for your kids' faith? Go all in for your kids' faith. I see so many parents today who are spending so much time and so much energy trying to get their kids an athletic scholarship. And let me just say this, your kids aren't really that good at sports. They're not. And you're paying people to tell them they're good. That just is the way that whole system works. And they're probably not going to get a scholarship. There's not that many. So would you please just invest in their spiritual life? I've never had anybody ever in 25 years of ministry come to me and say, Brad, I really wish I would have emphasized their relationship with Jesus less. Nobody's ever come and said, they love God so much, they're not really doing anything with their life. I've never heard anybody say that. I've had plenty of people come to me when their kids are juniors and seniors in college, or when they've gotten married and they're living off in some far place, and they say, would you please pray for my kids? I never really showed them how to love Jesus. I never showed them how to have a relationship with Jesus. I've had plenty of those conversations. And so parents, if you have kids, would you please go all in for their faith? Every single week, there's a group of people who pour themselves out to make Jesus the most relevant, important, impactful person in their life here at Summit. And the more you do to leverage that, I believe the better off your kids are. It's way better than them getting a college scholarship. And let me also say this. When they get to junior high and high school, would you prioritize things like youth ministry? Again, 25 years of ministry, and I'm just going to tell you this. 25 years of ministry, and I was in college ministry for a really long time, and when I would meet college students that were in their junior, senior year, graduating, heading into life, and they were just navigating the bumps and the bruises of life with grace and peace and joy, time and time again, and I know there are exceptions to this, but time and time again, those are the students whose parents laid a foundation and said, no, I'm going to do everything possible so that you're a part of a youth ministry, a student ministry, that you can build relationships in with people that actually love Jesus that are your age. Time and time again, that's the case. And so if that means that you got to pick them up early from practice and you got to bring them here a little bit late and you got to have them eat dinner on the way here, you would do that for their academics. You would do that for their athletics. Would you please do that for their faith? Go all in for your kids. College students, let me just tell you this. Go all in. Every single week down at Summit U, there's a group of young adults that gather. The reason that we prioritize that ministry is because we believe that in this season of your life, when you are making decisions about who you will marry and what you will do and where you will live and where you will go, that the most important thing you can do is have a tight relationship with Jesus. So will you go all in? Invest yourself in those things. Develop the relationships. Listen to the stories that are true. Develop the habits. Couples. Can I just say this to married couples in the room? Jesus says some things about what it looks like to be married in his kingdom that are very different than what our culture says. For example, Jesus says that men should lay down their lives for their wives the way he did for the church. And last time I checked, Jesus died for the church. And I don't see a lot of husbands that are dying for their wives. And sometimes I just imagine all the marriages that could be healed, all the relationships that would be fixed, if husbands would just go all in on what Jesus said works for marriage. Instead, we hold back in our pride. We hold back and we resist. We think there might be a better option. We're not willing to go there. And yet, if we do what he says and we go all in, I believe he will redeem our relationships. Ladies, wives, it's the same thing for you. Would you go all in loving and serving and respecting your husband. Go all in on those things. Quit holding back. There are truths, and you go, I know I'm supposed to. I don't know, I'm kind of resistant. I don't want to get hurt. Go all in. For all of us in the room, think about the way we use our time, the way we use our resources, the way we spend our money. And I know there's this thing that's like, I'm too busy right now, and now you don't know, my life's filled with all sorts of storms. So was Peter's. And he got out of the boat. Will you get out of the boat and go all in with Jesus? By the way, I don't think any of the disciples, when Peter got in the boat, I don't think any of the disciples said, "Oh, Peter, you're an idiot. What are you doing?" I guarantee every one of them, you know what they thought? Why didn't I get out of the boat? I could have walked on water. And I don't want you to end your days, and I don't want to end my days saying, why didn't I go all in? Why didn't I swing a leg over the side? Why didn't I try to walk on water? Why did I wait for things to calm down? Why didn't I just jump in and go all in for Jesus? And if you do, maybe in the middle of that, you will hear him say, take heart. I am. And you got this. Amen? Would you stand with me? If you want to pray with somebody tonight or talk with somebody, or every week there's folks that, at least they should be down here with name tags on, to provide coaching and prayer and answer questions. And I want to say that tonight just because I don't always say it, but there's always folks that are available to do that. And now as you go, I just want to keep this really simple. You can probably guess what I'm going to say. May you be men and women who go all in for Jesus. Get out of the boat and walk on some water. Amen? Amen. Love you guys so much. Thanks for being here tonight. Hang out, talk to some friends, develop some relationships, cultivate those, and we'll see you guys next Sunday. See you later.